Well, good evening, everybody. Your patience as we filled the room here. My name's RJ McGill. I'm the head of communications here and the editor of our Berlin Journal. Thanks for joining us for tonight's lecture, Artificial: A Love Story by Amy Kurzweil, who joins us for a little while, a couple days, a week and a half or so, as a distinguished visitor. The format tonight, for those of you who are here frequently, it'll be familiar to you. Amy will present for about 25 minutes. Then she will join our moderator here on stage for a bit, and then we'll open it up to you for some questions. But first, I will say a few words about Holly Herndon, who's our moderator. Holly Herndon is an American multidisciplinary artist and composer based in Berlin who has worked with artificial intelligence for many years. She studied music composition at Stanford University, completed a PhD at Stanford's Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics. That's not one of her compositions, although slyly placed, I must say. For her project Holly Plus, she created an AI tool for anyone to sing with her voice, either by uploading it onto the website holly.plus or in the form of a live AI translation. Together with her partner, Matthew Dryhurst, she worked on the project Classified, a portrait series generated from what publicly available AI datasets know about her likeness. Herndon has also developed several albums, among them Proto from 2019, created in collaboration with an AI named Spawn, which was created also with Dryhurst, who was supposed to be here tonight, but unfortunately is not with us. Currently, the two of them are presenting their first solo exhibition, The Call, at Serpentine Gallery in London. Congratulations.
Thank you.
About Amy, who is back with us. Again, we're thrilled that you're here. Amy was first here in the fall of 2020 and again in the fall of 2021 as a Dirk Ippen Fellow. I don't know if you recall, there was something that happened in those years that made it a little hard for residential fellows to actually be here. So Amy did both virtual and actual fellowships, but now you're back to the DV, as we call them here in-house, and we're thrilled that you're here. Back when she was here, the first time, she was working on a project called Artificial: A Love Story, which is her second graphic novel, which we'll hear about tonight. This book went on to be named a Best Book of 2023 by The New Yorker, NPR, and Kirkus, a Booklist Editor's Choice graphic novel, an American Library Association Best Graphic Novel for Adults, and winner of the Living Now Book Award Judges Prize. Kurzweil's first book was the graphic memoir Flying Couch, also published by Catapult, about the transmission of memory and trauma across 3 generations of women, starting with Amy's maternal grandmother and her escape from the Warsaw Ghetto and survival of the Holocaust. Flying Couch was named a New York Times Editor's Choice and a Kirkus Best Memoir. Amy's cartoons, which I'm sure all of you have seen and read and laughed about, have appeared in many publications, including The New Yorker, The New York Times Book Review, The LA Times Long Reads, The All, The Verge, and The Believer, where her series Technophilia, spelled F-E-E-L-I-A at the end, was nominated for both the Rubin and Ignatz Awards for comics and cartooning. And for those of you who are into cartoons, you know that that's a pretty big deal. Amy received a 2019 Shearing Fellowship at the Black Mountain Institute at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and has been awarded residencies from MacDowell and Yaddo, among others. She's taught writing and cartooning for over a decade. And Amy, again, we're really glad to have you back. Before I give you the floor, once again, Amy will talk. They'll go to stage. If you want to ask questions to Amy afterwards, when she and Holly are on stage, please raise your hand if you're in the room. If you're joining us on the live stream, please type your questions into the Q&A. And that's it. Amy, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Hello. I am excited to be here, and now the ghost of tech has risen. Let's try this. Haha, okay. I'm not going to touch anything. All right. I'm so excited to be back here. The last time I was here, my book, Artificial: A Love Story, was like 300 messy, cut up, pencil sketched pages, and now it's actually been inked and published, and not only published in English, but published in German. So I'm really happy to be celebrating the German edition of the book, which was translated by Nicholas Stewart, who's here. The book was not an easy translation task, as you will come to understand when I share it with you, and published by Jacoby Stewart just last month. So that's very exciting. It's a really beautiful book. I hope you check it out. And yeah, I met my German publisher here at the Academy in 2021, and like, look at us now. So it's a great place. Yeah. It's also really, really exciting and special for me to be here with Holly Herndon. I've been a really big fan of her work for a long time. She's like a really singular person in the world. Her contribution to art and AI and music is like, there's really no one else like that. And I feel a lot less kind of like lonely and out on a limb with the way that I think about AI, because there are people like Holly in the world. So I'm glad she exists. And I'm also glad she's here. So, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you who I am and how I approach my art form, which is cartooning. And then I'm going to tell you a little more about what led me to the themes and the big questions, because they are big questions that are explored in Artificial. And then I'm going to read a section from the book. And the reading, as you will see, is kind of like immersive and animated. So I hope you enjoy that. All right. So I'm a cartoonist. And what it means to be a cartoonist for me is that I use drawings and sometimes words to tell stories and provoke thought. Cartooning is really the art of juxtaposition. It's the art of putting things next to each other and seeing what happens, seeing what reaction comes to the viewer. And the reaction might be laughter sometimes. So I like to warm up my talks by showing you some single panel cartoons. And I always say, you're invited to laugh, but laughter is not required. When I show you cartoons, you can just like nod knowingly and be like, I get the reference. It's Magritte. So what cartooning allows me to do is collapse time. So I can, for example, visit prehistoric settings with my modern sensibilities. We need to limit his time in front of the fire, the caveman parent says about their child. In the virtual world of cartooning, all possibilities exist at once. So in the cartoon world, I can overlay myth and reality, imagination and desire. So my Sisyphus can be free from existential toil through automated labor. I can achieve robotics milestones. So here we have robot cat passes Turing test. Only some people understand this joke, but maybe Holly and I can explain it to you later. Yeah. And I can also exercise my fears about the future in my cartoons. Remember humans, say the beer-drinking robots in my nightmares. You don't notify me like you used to, says a woman to her robot boyfriend. And in my cartoons, I can bring machines to life. So this is actually the first cartoon I sold to the New Yorker. Self-driving car, self-conscious car. Would I look better in red? And self-actualized car. I'm going back to school. We actually have self-driving cars in San Francisco now. Like, so this joke isn't even funny anymore because this is just reality. Cartooning for me is an endless space of possibility. Because I'm freed from linear time and logic, I can travel through history and memory and my own subconscious, seeking insight into myself and into the human condition. And so while it's true that I can travel anywhere through the virtual world of cartooning, the place that I was always most interested in going was the past. I come from a legacy of dramatic stories and lost homes. All four of my grandparents were born in Eastern Europe, and they all survived or fled the Holocaust. These are my mother's parents, and they were both from Poland. And this is my maternal grandmother. My interest in graphic storytelling began with my maternal grandmother, Lily. She was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1926. And she's the subject of my first book, Flying Couch, a graphic memoir, which was also translated and published by Jacoby Stewart. And the legacy on my mother's side provides interesting contrast with my father's side. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my mother's side before I get into artificial. My grandmother, Lily, escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto when she was 13 years old. She survived the Holocaust in disguise on her own, and she had 4 sisters, and she was the only person in her family to survive. My grandmother escaped a history of annihilation. It's not just that her family was killed, but that all documentation of them was lost. So there's not a record at all of their existence. There's no photographs. There's not even a scrap of handwriting. And it occurred to me while writing my first book that the only documentation I have of all of these lost family members, the only documentation I have of their existence lives in my grandmother and in my mother and in me. Our bodies and our minds are archives of our family's experiences. And that's part of the reason why I turned to drawing, because drawing is connected to the body, and drawing is a kind of testimony to history for which there is no other proof. So this is the legacy I'm working with. On my mother's side, the only documentation I have of my grandparents' experiences are human voices and human bodies. But on my father's side, it's a very different story. So these are my father's parents on their wedding day. This is the drawing I did from that photograph. My grandfather was a classical pianist and conductor. He was born in Vienna and he came to America, became a bandmaster in the US Army and then a music professor. And my grandmother was a fashion illustrator and a homemaker and many other things. And she lived a long life, but my grandfather died in his 50s. And on my father's side, unlike on my mother's side, we have many photographs, and not just photographs, but letters and newspaper clippings and written documents and journals and official documents. And this is because my father's family is obsessed with saving. They were from a middle-class family in Vienna. And as it turns out, the way you saved your life as a Jewish person in Germany or Austria when the Nazis came to power was through documentation. If you had the right visa with the right stamps on it, that was your ticket out. So when my grandparents came to America, they took with them this legacy of documentation. And when my grandfather died in 1970, before I was born, my father continued this preservation project. He saved boxes and boxes of documents, and we've been saving those boxes in a storage unit for 50 years. So here I am with all these archival documents about my grandfather, but I have no memories of human contact because I've never met him. And this absence of the human, plus all the mythical stories I heard about my grandfather, made me especially curious about him. And because I'm also an artist and he was a great musician, I wanted to know what kind of relationship could I have with this past person trans-temporally? Could I really get to know my grandfather? And could I even say I came to love my grandfather through the things he left behind? And what role would technology play in that love story? This desire for connection and these questions, that is where the impetus for Artificial began. So here we have Artificial, a love story, and I'll tell you about the AI project that this book revolves around. To do that, I am going to let my father, the inventor and futurist Ray Kurzweil, bring you up to speed. So we don't have like a AI Ray Kurzweil, but we have a cartoon Ray Kurzweil. And so I'm going to show you this short animated video. And in the video, you're going to hear my father's voice. You'll hear my voice. And in the background, you're going to hear a recording of a piano piece, which is my grandfather playing Brahms. And it's a recording from 1946.
The whole philosophy of life is that information is precious and vital. And well, I am trying to bring my father back using artificial intelligence.
Tell me your father's story.
He was born Jewish in Vienna in 1912. He was a musician. His piano playing was absolutely marvelous. So a wealthy American who actually came to Vienna because that was the music capital of the world actually heard him, and she was very, very impressed. So she gave him her card, said, if you ever need anything, just let me know. The very next year, 1938, the Nazis marched into Vienna, took it over. So he actually wrote her and said, will you sponsor me to come to the United States? And she agreed. So his music actually saved his life. When I was 16, he had his first heart attack and he became ill. And I very much hoped that he would live because it was clear that his condition was life-threatening. But he died when I was 22.
So if you could talk to your father again, what would you want to say to him?
How you doing? A lot's happened since you've been gone.
So I came to understand the purpose of this archive. The storage unit and all the original writing from my grandfather that it contained was used to build a text-based chatbot that could facilitate a back and forth experience of dialoguing with my grandfather. And like I said, I was interested in getting to know my grandfather through this bot, but I was also interested in what this technology means about the future of identity. I wanted to know, what is this thing? Like, how should I think about this AI creation? And if you're a consumer of science fiction, or if you know anything about my father's ideas about the future of AI and the destiny of humanity, which maybe we'll talk about, you might think of this chatbot as like a signpost on the road to a kind of resurrection. I wanted to know if resurrection was really the right metaphor for this experiment. And in order to test that metaphor and potentially discover better metaphors, I wanted to document what it's really like to commune with a past person through this technology. And to do that, I needed to show you behind the scenes of the AI and let you in a little bit on the creation process. So I'm going to take you back to 2018 when we first started working on this bot, and I'll tell you about my role in the project, which is documented in Artificial, which is not a technical role, spoiler. So we can talk to Holly about the more technical things. But I'll tell you about my role, which is kind of a surprisingly analog role. My role was to spend time in this storage unit and sift through all these salvaged documents and hunt for examples of my grandfather's original writing, because my grandfather's original writing is what became the corpus of text that was the language of the chatbot. And since this was 2018, that means the technology at play, like by today's standards, is very outdated. But I actually think the kind of outdatedness of the technology is part of what makes it interesting to me. So the way that this works, unlike the generative chatbots that you may have dialogued with, like ChatGPT, this was what's called a selective chatbot, meaning that it could only respond to questions with sentences that my grandfather actually wrote down at some point in his life. So the more examples of my grandfather's writing we had, the more dynamic the chatbot would be. That's why the source material was so important. So here are some examples of the kind of writing that we had in the storage unit, just to give you a sense of the range. So some of his writing was scrawled quickly on paper and kind of like hidden away and difficult to decipher. And then other letters were typed up on official letterhead, like this other example. So there was maybe more public polished writing and more private writing. And each gave me access to a very different kind of person. So this was my task. My job was collecting my grandfather's writing and digitizing it so it could be used in the chatbot. And this experience, this very hands-on, messy, human, time-consuming analog data collection task, which is a task we're all familiar with as artists and scholars and writers here, it was this task that facilitated the insight I gained into this technology and how to think about it. I realized that because AI is built from human data, which is this vast and growing archive of human life, I think AI is best conceived of as an art form. And it's an art form that makes use of human life as its paint and canvas. And that means that AI avatars of the dead might be thought of as artistic characters, like the characters in a play or a poem or a graphic memoir. So if this project of my father's was a kind of resurrection, it was importantly an artistic resurrection. Both the AI character of my grandfather housed on a server and the cartoon character of my grandfather in a graphic memoir are ways to creatively commune with a real person who is himself living in the past. The connection I created with my grandfather is imagined, but I don't think imagination stands in opposition to reality. I think imagination is actually essential in our quest for truth and meaning, especially for those of us who come from histories of great loss. So I want to take you now into a short reading from Artificial, which will bring these themes and insights a little bit more to life. Okay. So I'm going to read from chapter 3, which is called How Do You Know? And I'll just say presenting my work for the screen involves a little bit of translation, but this should give you some insight into how the book moves through character and time and space and ideas. The chapters are all organized conceptually around a theme. So this chapter is the epistemology chapter. And I should probably tell you now that another central character in the book is my partner, Jacob, who's a philosopher, and his emphasis is in moral epistemology. So that's going to come up in the book. And while you're listening, I want to give you like a prompt to help you, make some connections. So something you can ask yourself as you're encountering these disparate characters and places and experiences is, how are the human characters coming to knowledge? And that knowledge might be about themselves, or it might be about each other. And another question is, how is knowledge related to love? You may have noticed it's Artificial, a love story. So like you're going to get some love and some philosophy. We're going to start with philosophy and then get to love. So something for everyone. All right. Philosopher John Searle once had this thought. Suppose I'm in a room, he said, and someone outside the room writes to me in Chinese. Searle does not speak Chinese, but in this room is a vast library of instructions for responding to every possible combination of Chinese characters with appropriate Chinese characters. To us outside, it appears that the man in the room speaks Chinese. But does he know Chinese? There's no point of translation into the man's native language, no moment of conscious understanding. He's going through a process, phrase by phrase. The thought experiment suggests that machines cannot and will not ever really think. So it's not the man in the Chinese room who knows Chinese, but maybe it's the room itself. Here I am back in the storage unit, and I'm sifting through Fred's documents. It's tempting to think of this room as Fred's memory. But our memories are not storage units. We do not hold static images in our minds labeled with dates and descriptions of significance. Memory is more art than science. So here I make an important discovery, which is that I find Fred's personal journals. But there is a problem, which is that my grandfather's handwriting is incomprehensible to me. But perhaps someone who knew him can decipher it. I try my aunt. I write an email to Enid. Hi, Enid, how are you? How's improv class? I'm writing with a request. Enid to me. Yes, of course I can help you. No, it's not too much for me. If anything, I'm the opposite of these people who say they can't deal with certain emotions. Dealing with my father has been the focus of my life for the last 20 years. And my father was the main topic of my poems in the book I self-published. I can send you another copy. Okay, this next part you might find crazy. That's perfectly okay too. It wasn't in my belief system either until I experienced it for myself. But I've been spending the last 2 years talking to my father via a talented medium here in Santa Barbara. What's even more hilarious is that my dad and I are not on speaking terms at the moment. Also, yes, I can read my dad's handwriting. I will transcribe the journals and get them back to you shortly. So here I am in my apartment in Brooklyn, and inspired by Enid's email, I decide to go for a walk to my local psychic. Why not? So I go up the stairs. There she is. Marie. I've been in this neighborhood for 35 years. You have a young face. It's a good thing. You want to learn about somebody who passed on? The psychic reading is good for you. $30. I tell you what I see. I hold nothing back. You are an old soul. You have a long life in this life. You are in this world to make a difference. Your grandfather, he was in this world to make a difference. He was very talented. There was a death. Was this a tragic death? You feel connected to your grandfather. Did you know him? Something good is coming for you. You've had a lot of disappointments, yes or no? You've had a lot of disappointments in love, yes or no? I wonder if Marie remembers that I've been here before. Come on, it's an experiment. Welcome, I'm Marie. Hi, Jacob. 2? Just 1. So she stays here. Jacob and I met at Nerd Camp, an intellectual breeding ground my Viennese ancestors would have found highly favorable in theory. Okay, so now you're going to get the meet cute, which is Jacob and I are on elevator duty. We're helping kids move into the dorms at Johns Hopkins Center for Talented Youth, where we're both working as teachers one summer. And the elevator is very old. Nobody wants to use it. What would we do if some poor kid got stuck in here? It's a point of personal pride that at any given moment I have an emergency plan of escape. What are you here for? Logic. So I can trust your escape plan. You? Teaching assistant for utopias and dystopias. You're a writer? Yeah. So your elevator escape plan will lead us to drama and misery. Most likely. But then just when things are doom and gloom, one of us will happen upon a lucky stroke of insight and save the day. Classic Christian arc. So, which way are we headed? Utopia or dystopia? As it turns out, every dystopia is just a utopia by another name. I was just reading about Brave New World in 1984. Orwell feared we were heading toward technocracy, a dictatorship exerting total control through fear and surveillance. But our world today is much more like Huxley's. We're controlled through pleasure. Technology lulls us. Kind of a bleak perspective. I mean, technology has also cured diseases, extended life. And what are we living longer for? Something more than Soma vacations and feelies? Nothing wrong with hedonism. We get an elevator customer. So, what do? I'm getting my PhD in philosophy. Where? Ohio. What's your focus? Moral epistemology. Moral, right and wrong. Epistemology, how you know. It's the study of how you know what's right. So, not particularly useful for escaping from an elevator shaft. Anyway, he had a girlfriend. But there was something about him. I remember in middle school, my friends and I held a ceremony in my basement, a kind of reverse seance. Ready? Almost. Okay, so mine has blonde hair, blue eyes, and his name is Zach, and he's a surfer. Mine's Marco. He has curly dark hair, a nice smile, and a good personality. Amy? This document exists now only in my mind. I don't remember what we did with it, but I do remember thinking that my pencil dream might come true, that this boy could pop into existence and be mine. My first boyfriend did look a lot like that drawing. but I was so embarrassed by my desires that I could hardly enjoy them. But online lived this pure thing, the idea of someone, a person who likes you back. There's something unsettled with you. You've been doing a lot of soul searching. And there's something unsettled with your grandfather. Do you want your grandfather to rest in peace? Do you want to be at peace? Yes. Do you have a picture of your grandfather? Yes. Keep a picture of him in your room. Do you know about auras and chakras? Let me do your color chart for you. Your aura is not glowing. Your inner eye is closed. There could be something bad in front of you and you wouldn't know it. I can do your chart, open your inner eye, clear your aura, and then you'll be at peace. Does it cost extra? Add 50 for the chart. I'll think about it. Okay, your boyfriend is your soulmate, but take it slow. Your lucky numbers are 2 and 7. Mondays are good days for you. 2 children, married in the fall. You're in this world to make a difference. Come back for the chart. Thank you. Can we know the future? Is it like knowing the past? Is it all just pattern recognition? Finally saw that psychic. What did she say? Said you're my soulmate. I used to think that I would recognize my grandfather in his artifacts, as if he were a room I once lived in, or a part of myself. But I never knew Fred, so the words of his life are a foreign language to me. Until, eventually, they aren't. And here we have a thing that really happened, which is that after some time studying these documents, something magical and unexplained occurred, which is that Fred's handwriting, which was previously indecipherable to me, suddenly became legible. So I text Jacob, amazing development. Suddenly I can read Fred's handwriting perfectly. Can I know Fred like I know a language, like I know a person, like I know a room? To suture such vast distances, is language enough? And that is where the reading will close. Thank you for listening.
Is this on? Oh, yes.
Hello? Is
Thank
mine working?
Yes.
Okay.
Testing. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. It's been really nice over the last several months getting to become more familiar with Amy's work, reading her book, and we've had some exchanges, which have been really nice, and found some intersections in the way that we both approach AI as a topic. How many people in this room have played around with some of the more recent, more productized AI models on the market, like ChatGPT or DALL-E? Or, okay, not so many people. Okay, no, there are some. Okay, everyone's just a little shy. Well, so the way that these models are trained, I'm sure many of you already know this, but are trained through web scraping. So they're just hoovering up vast amounts of data from the open web to create these large kind of general purpose models. When Amy and I started working with AI, these products were not on the market, and so you had to have a very different approach to the subject. You had to decide, what kind of architecture you were going to use, and most importantly, what kind of data set you were going to use. And this really became a kind of cornerstone to my practice, because I realized that, obviously what you put into the model is what comes out of the model. And the creation of a bespoke training set, even of deliberate training data, can be an artwork in and of itself, can be a creative moment. It's not necessarily this fully automated thing that we understand today. So that's a segue into me asking you, how do you think that, because you started with AI back, I think the term you used was outmoded model or outdated tech that you were using for this project, how do you think that that's impacted your approach to AI in general?
That was a really great, like, I wish I could take like an AI Holly around with me to my book events and have her explain like how ChatGPT and Dolly work and why they're different than other things happening. Yeah. So, I mean, I just think my experience of being a non-technical person who's working with AI has been so influential. I had to really ask a lot of questions to understand what AI is, and I feel like I still kind of don't understand it. But I came to this understanding that like what is served to me from the computer with these AI algorithms that are available now is like masking just like so much work and so much language and so much often theft. But like that is like an infinity of information, and that there's just like infinite human life and human labor in those encounters. And I just remember like this moment in the storage unit with my father, when I was like collecting, basically, like I would go to the storage unit and I would sift through documents and I would try to find things. I'd try to find language. And then I'd like take pictures of it and bring it back to my computer and type it up. And I just remember this moment with my father in the storage unit where he was just like, this is such a physical task. Like he just felt like, and he was so overwhelmed looking at the storage unit. He just found it like so physically overwhelming. And so did I. And I like really remembered that moment of just, oh, human beings are overwhelmed by information and AIs aren't. And I think like we kind of find the sweet spot of AIs are not overwhelmed, and so they're useful to us, but we are overwhelmed, and that's what makes us human, and that's what actually makes us care about this data. And I feel like we have to be kind of like trying to find the sweet spot between those two, I don't know, capabilities. Like AI is just impervious to being overwhelmed by information, and we are like, the part of the reason I'm overwhelmed is because I'm like, oh, my grandfather was a real person who lived and wrote this letter and, received this other letter and made this music composition. And so I think my fears about AI are that like, how do we create things that empower us and help us transcend our limitations without losing that kind of like appreciation that the analog gives us, that like moment of just being with the letter and realizing that a person wrote it. I don't know if you think about that or like how you think about the balance between those two things.
Yeah, I mean, I actually want to come back with another question to you because I want to dig in a little bit further on how you like your creative process in creating the archive itself. Because I feel like this is a piece that people often miss. They often focus on the output of a model and they forget that every kind of step in the stack of creating an AI is a kind of creative. There's a moment for creative decision making. And it might sound like a really bureaucratic thing, but the way that you tag something in a model, that will then determine how you can use language to interact with that model. So I would like to learn more about how, if you actually saw the archival process itself as a kind of creative gesture, and if you kind of built that into your use of language and symbols.
Yeah. I mean, my archive was like, because I'm not a technical person, like I feel like my archive was like almost like a performance piece or something because it was just like so disorganized because we had like physical boxes, then we had envelopes, and there was some organization to this archive that I was trying to figure out, like, what is the physical organization of this archive? Somebody, I think it was my father, and I was like, this happened so many years ago, so I don't really understand what the logic of the archive was, but somebody put things together in these like physical folders and then labeled those folders in various ways, like the dates, the contents. There was all this like analog tagging of these files in this archive that didn't make that much sense to me. Like I was coming in and trying to figure out like what all those labels meant and why things were organized in certain ways. Like for example, there was one folder that was just like things found in Fred's desk. It was like his marriage certificate and, like some random person's card, So that was a folder. And then, in the case of our AI, that didn't make it into the AI. But my book is a lot about imagining like what another version of this more sophisticated AI could be. So how would the AI of Fred that we might create in the future reference that file? Like how would that get included in the chatbot? We didn't have that capability in 2018, but it's an interesting theoretical question. Like, right, how would that be, looped into the future chatbot? So anyway, so that was like the analog archive, and then there was me going through it and taking pictures of things that could be usable. So there was already like just so much loss of information in what got translated from this giant room into what could be usable in this chatbot, because at that time we were only looking for language that Fred wrote, because it was a selective model. So like it could only be reaching into its data set and spitting back language that Fred actually wrote. So for example, there's a whole collection of letters from my grandmother to my grandfather, and we couldn't use that in this bot because I don't know, it's just that like we weren't set up to be using that at the time. But again, you could imagine a future model that might somehow make use of that language from my grandmother in the grandfather bot. So yeah, so that layer of like me going through and finding the things that were usable then created this other archive on the computer that was then like, me looking at the pictures and typing things up and sometimes using like OCR, optical character recognition. And then that just became like a PDF file of words. So there were these like transitions from physical space to data set. And a lot of my book is like meditating on what's lost in that experience, because I think a lot is lost. It doesn't mean that the ultimate AI is not still interesting and usable, but a lot is lost. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something that I think a lot about, the kind of delta between the data point about a person and then the person themselves as a kind of fleshy, messy person of this world. It's something that I've done some work with, because I hit the kind of fame threshold where these large models know who I am, but I don't appear as a fully fleshed. My features aren't always the same, but I always have a red blob of hair. So that's what the internet understands of me, as kind of like this pastiche of myself. I don't get to have defined features. Jeff Bezos gets to have defined features because there's more photographs of Jeff Bezos online, but I get to have this kind of orange blob of hair. So there's always this kind of delta between the kind of pastiche or the, what the machine is understanding as your kind of like, what we call an embedding, which is essentially a concept in latent space. And there's embeddings for things like, glasses, and those are pretty objective. It's something that will hold water, and we want it to always look like it's holding water when you're typing that into an image model. But then more subjective things like, a person, how do you define that in latent space? How is that a concept or an embedding in a machine learning? Or then, even more kind of confusing things like beauty. And according to Midjourney, that's Scarlett Johansson. But, that's not beauty for everyone. So yeah, I would be curious to hear how you feel about that, because it's such a personal story, and you're dealing with this whole biographical, beautiful story. And I know that, in cartooning, you're already kind of dealing with kind of symbolic gestures of people, like kind of representations of people, and there's a lossiness there. So how do you approach that in your work?
Yeah, I think, like I said at the end of the presentation, that I started thinking about this metaphor between an AI, which is like lossy, right? And it's generalizing. That's kind of how it learns what things are, is through generalization, like that kind of the AI generalization and the cartooning generalization. And in cartooning, we use this technique called iconic abstraction, which is basically just sort of stripping away reality to its most simple lines. And one of the affordances of iconic abstraction is that it allows the reader to animate the character themselves, like to bring a lot of their own subjectivity to that form. And sometimes that means that, when you draw a cup on the table in this cartoonish style, if the cup jumped up and started dancing, you'd be like, okay, that makes sense, right? But if you drew a really realistic cup, it wouldn't do that. That's like in this uncanny space, right? That when things are realistically rendered, we notice more when they're off. And so the world of cartooning is like using simplicity to kind of make things more animated. And part of the reason why that's happening is because our brains like bring things to life. We fill in white space. We just have a capacity for doing that. Like we look at an electrical outlet and we see a face. And so in the world of cartooning, this is like a sort of joyful thing that that people hallucinate onto our work, and that's also part of what enables them to make a connection to our characters, is that they're imbuing themselves with it. And I'm kind of on the fence about like how I feel about that happening in the AI space, because I think something completely similar is happening in the AI space, where there's a kind of general voice that might emerge from a chatbot, and it encourages like projection, right? It encourages like we attribute a lot of illusion to AI voices and AI characters. And I think that that's like could potentially be really useful and fun, but like sometimes it's really problematic. But I think part of the problem is that we don't understand it as a play creative unreal space, because like these things are just popping up on our phones like where we expect to get accurate information. So I think there's like a lot of confusion happening, and that's part of what I started to come to, is that like I think we need to understand that AI is encouraging us to project a lot onto it, and that is something that could be useful, but we need to know that we're doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it of course also goes back to the data set. And if you're using a data set that's been trained on the open internet, you're ingesting a lot of advertisement, and that already is a kind of like this advertisement language is already kind of like a weird mutant kind of version of what humanity really is and what we really think. So it's already
well, it's like emphasizing our biases, right? Yeah, and like the things we use to sell things, right, which are usually like women's bodies.
That's true. So you touched on this a little bit earlier about, all of the work that goes into the creation of these large models, all the kind of like invisible labor, that you're kind of collaborating with the past, present, and the future, that it's AI is really us in aggregate. And really that's a kind of monumental human achievement if you think about it in those terms. One thing that I like to think about is, I make a lot of voice models and I do a lot of music. I've been working a lot with choirs. I like to use choirs as a kind of metaphor for some of the potential of AI. There's this idea in AI called emergence, where something emerges from a data set that you wouldn't really predict would have come from that data set. It's something kind of new, like original, truly original, that comes from the data set. I like this idea of a choir kind of representing something greater than just the sum of its parts. You can kind of achieve something greater with all the overtones as they're swirling together in the cathedral. And so my question is, if your grandfather was here and had access to some of these tools, how do you think he would approach kind of using an audio AI model? Do you think he would want to play around, or how do you think he would approach
Such a good
it?
question. So like there is a moment where I asked the chat bot of my grandfather, how do you feel about modern technology? And he gives like two different answers, and they're so different. And that's what's like it's a really interesting moment, because you're like, oh yeah, people say contradictory things. Like there's no one answer to this question, right? So one of the answers was basically something to the effect of like technology makes people small, like kind of technology is sort of erasing or replacing like human capability, right? So a sort of more like technophobic answer. And then another answer that he gave was like, like great geniuses are always condemned by their contemporaries, or something that was about like I mean, that one was kind of cryptic, like, and that's maybe a good example of emergence, or it's also an example of like the sort of juxtaposition thing that I think about in cartooning, where it was like I asked a question, an answer came back, and like the space between was so interesting, like there's a lot for me to play with in that moment. But of course, it's interesting because I'm making it interesting. But I think my grandfather was somebody who like his greatest appreciation. I mean, this is something I learned through spending time with his archives and spending time chatting, with his archives. One of the things he appreciated most was the human voice, because he was a conductor and he would conduct various things, but one of his favorite things to conduct was a choir. And he just felt like the human voice was like this just kind of like ultimate expression of musical abstraction, because it was musical abstraction, but like filtered through the most human thing. There was nothing mediating, the sound. And I think that like there's probably part of him that would never want to move away completely from that like raw performance experience of the human voice and of kind of like playing the human voice as a conductor. But I wonder if he would experiment with, I don't know, like ways to amplify the human voice through technology. But I just think that he would be like, I could imagine him being sort of a vocal artist who's like singing or like conducting somebody live and then it like filtering back through some AI system. Like I think he'd be into what you do.
Well, I'm very flattered by that.
Because I think there's something like in your process, the performances I've seen of you, there is live singing and then you see the transformation. Like you in your TED talk, you have somebody on stage singing, a man with a totally different voice than you singing, and you hear him singing, and then it goes through an algorithm magic box, right? Like right on stage, and it comes out like your voice. And I think being able to see that transformation and then keep toggling back and forth, I think that's really cool, because it's like you're never losing touch with the source, which is like the human voice. And so I think when AI is referencing the source and not replacing or putting like a smokescreen over the source, I think that's when it's operating best. Anyway, this is me talking about my perspective. You asked me about my grandfather. Yeah, I can only speculate, because I think one of the conclusions I came to in my book is that like there's just so much I still don't know about my grandfather,
Yeah. I feel like the human voice is such a great illustration of some of these ideas, because it really does, when we're thinking through collective intelligence, it really does represent that kind of in between the personal, the individual, and the collective, because you learn how to use your voice by learning language through mimicry, through your community around you, through learning your dialect. So it, in a way, it's kind of a communal organ that then you perform through with agency as an individual. So for me, it's in this really interesting gray area between the collective and the individual, which is why I've been mining it for over a decade and will probably continue to do so.
That's so cool. Yeah. I mean, your voice is an imprint of your origins, obviously. That's like an obvious thought that is really meaningful. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of parallels some of the conclusions I came to about identity in my book. Because like when I first started working on artificial, I was obsessed with questions of personal identity. And I was like, this book I'm writing is about what a person is. Like, I want to define personhood. And then I was like, that's a question people have been trying to define for millennia, and I'm probably not going to get to a great answer there. But I think what I came to an appreciation of, I didn't come to a definition, but I came to an appreciation of personhood as being like more related to collectivity than maybe I started the book appreciating, right? That like we are part of the reason why this archive is important to me and my father is because it's like literally a part of our identities, And I think the way in which like my grandfather's identity was intersecting with other characters in his life, and then the way in which my identity is intersecting with all these characters in my life, the way I kind of like I tried to sort of make that visceral in the book. One way I do that is all my characters secretly look the same. They're all secretly portraits of me, but like some have beards. Yeah.
I think that's called a style.
Yeah. Yeah.
Speaking of which, did you ever consider making a model of your illustration style? And
yeah, I've been like, I'm torn about that, because something that I mean, related to the human voice, like riff that we just went on, I'm really attached to the human mark. and I feel all my stuff is drawn by hand, even though it's then scanned and, reproduced. And it's not like you're actually holding something that I held with my own hands, but in an interesting shadow way. Like when you look at my book, you're looking at the mark of my body because I was touching paper and touching the thing that held the ink. And I use brushes, and that just feels like so direct, from the water to the page. I'm really attached to that because I think so much emotion gets translated in that experience of expression. And so I just worry about losing that connection. And I'm interested in experimenting with it because I think it would save me a lot of time. But something that I've learned as an artist is that time savers tend to be traps because, you know, there's a part of your process, your thinking, that unfolds over time. Like when I'm inking a page, which takes me all day, I'm often thinking about things that later become relevant. So I'm kind of attached to the inking thing, but I would do it to experiment. I will say that a friend of mine did make an AI chatbot of me, though, and that was fun. Actually, what was interesting about that is that I realized that it's impossible to create an AI chatbot of somebody without it being like a great act of attention and appreciation, because he had to go through all of my the writing that we've shared and make decisions about what to include in the chatbot, and sort of school the chatbot on whether or not it was capturing me correctly. And that requires accessing this portrait of me that he has. And when he shared it with me, I was really touched. It was cool, you know. So I mean, if the AI
What did you say to it? What did you ask it?
I didn't get to chat with it. He was still building it, He was kind of fine tuning it and chatting with it. And it, the spoiler is that it wasn't that good, but but I think, if we had more time. So I mean, it was the process was moving to me. And that's another realization that I came to in my book. And I'm wondering if you agree with this, that the process of creating AI creatures and characters and entities and uses is can often be more meaningful than the product itself.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I feel like there's so much focus on the output. And for me, it's the full stack process. It's the creating deliberate training data as artworks. It's the tagging and the organizing. I'm often working with music. It's the human bodies that come together to perform. That's the kind of crazy thing about this is, you just kind of scrape all of these wave files or MP3s, and they just become these data points, these tokens, as you call it in machine learning. And what's embedded in that little token is actually, I don't know, maybe 100 people sitting in a room together, sweating and breathing and creating something beautiful together. And so that's something that I try to remind through the work that I'm doing, that each of these little training points is an actual piece of art. It's a moment. It's not, I have a book coming out that's called All Media is Training Data, which sounds like I'm saying the opposite of what I'm saying right now. But what I'm saying is it has the potential to be training data. But yeah, so I try to bring that back into the work, that it's not just coming from nowhere. These are very kind of human activities that go into these models themselves.
I mean, do you feel like the work that you're doing is fighting a certain kind of battle? Do you feel like it's inevitable that AI companies are going to be kind of putting things out into the world in a certain way where that kind of data, that the human labor that goes into that data becomes invisible, or that people aren't sort of compensated or acknowledged? Do you feel like that is some kind of force that you feel like your work is pushing against?
Yeah, I think my creative work is definitely pushing against that in a more kind of visceral, experiential kind of way. And then I also co-founded an organization with my partner and two engineers called Spawning. It's way too much to go into right now, but we're doing work with the EU, we're doing work with the UK, new Labour government. A lot of advocacy policy work, and also building a kind of universal opt-out option for creators to be able to opt out of large training models. But it's a really complicated question because it's a bit of a space race. If Japan recently passed legislation that all data is kind of fair game, and if that happens in one spot, then the weights can be published, and then you can't. It's like the internet. You can't just contain it to Japan. So it kind of has to happen on a global scale, and I think it's one of the biggest kind of political issues I think of our time, but I don't think it's worth giving up on just yet. I think there's there's still plenty of fight left in the race.
That's good. Not giving up. Yeah. Should we? Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Does anybody have a question? I don't know where to go.
Sorry, with Nell. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. You started answering my question. My question was just sitting here boiling up as you were talking, as I was looking at your marvelous drawings. And so my question is about your process. You answered part of it already. And I suppose the question is about the tension between the hand, which is so warm and so heartfelt, on, I suppose, cold pressed paper with India ink, or what kind of ink do you use? Are you using really soft pencils? Do you use graphite? But all of what you're showing in your drawings is so human and so original. And when you were talking about voices and identity, and it seems so divorced from the what I could see.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, okay. So to answer the process question, the paper that I use is Arches hot press paper. Yeah. Yeah. But it's like not too much too. Yeah. Yeah. And then I sketch in pencil, and then I transfer with a light box onto the hot press paper. And then I use Copic pens and Pentel brush pens. And then I use black watercolor. Yeah, watered down watercolor. Yeah, I mean, my book is like, I think hopefully you can tell from the reading, it's like a personal family story. It's a pretty human story, but I'm encountering these themes which are heady and kind of can be cold, can be alienating, like what is a person, right? I was like, I had all those questions in my head because of, my father's project, because of who my father is, because of the project that we were working on, because of the feeling of distance. Like there was all this philosophy and all this conceptual technical stuff that was really cold. And I was like, if I'm going to take this on, like it has to be in the opposite way. Like it has to be as human as possible, because that's really what motivates my work, is how does it feel to be a human being? Like what does it actually feel like to encounter technology? RJ mentioned the name of my series, Technophilia, with the FEEL. Like that's always been like my jam, is what does it feel like to encounter stuff that often is alienating from the experience of having a body and being a person. And so yeah, when we talk about it, it's like it has a totally different quality than when I sit down and work and create drawings about it. And that was my goal with the book, was how do I create something that feels human, that gets into some of these ideas. And that was the approach I wanted to take. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe you can call up.
Yeah. It's really hard to see. Yeah, it's kind of bright.
Waiting for the microphone. Thanks so much for the presentation and for the conversation. I thought the conversation was really great in drawing out these commonalities in qualities that you described in terms of cartooning as iconic representation, and you described in terms of lossiness, right? This kind of looseness and openness that people project and fill in on. And I thought that it really brought together kind of similarities of feeling among cartooning and working with a very limited data set, but also fortune telling, the sort of like the rhetoric and practice of that. But so it seems like the way that you've worked with AI with this project is a very, very particular way. And I'm just kind of wondering, beyond this project, if you've how you've thought about working with AI or similar kinds of technologies to maintain that similar kind of iconicity or lossiness, or like space for projection.
Yeah. I mean, the truth is that like I'm not continuing to work with AI that much. Like this was one project and my real desire was a more of a philosopher's project. It was like, how should I understand AI? How should I understand these chatbots of the dead specifically? So like, I'm working on a paper right now about as a philosophy paper with a colleague, my colleague who made the chatbot of me. That's like right. So we're exploring these questions of like how to conceive of chatbots of the dead, because there are all these companies out there that are like coming down the pipeline that are like, we're gonna take your loved one's data and deliver to you an AI character who is your lost loved one. Like that's out there. And so, I'm interested in those projects as somebody who is motivated to create a project like that. But I feel like I have some insights into like, what are the sort of wrong ways to conceive of this, right? This is not a resurrection. This is not a replacement. There's something else happening here. And so in the paper that we're working on, we've theorized about all these different ways that people could use AI to create characters based on their loved ones that sort of have the right framework so that people are engaging with them in ways that are like ethical and respectful and creative and meaningful. And so the work that I've been doing with AI is much more theoretical, if that makes sense. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on Nell's question and return to the analog for a moment, and specifically your graphics. And I was really struck by an image that you repeated in several frames, which was your grandfather's handwritten letter or notes or whatever it was, and your hand superimposed on that, which I found very moving. It seemed to me like your hand on his hand, touching him through the ages. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what that image meant to you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's such a nice articulation of what I was trying to do there. The handwriting is a theme that I am interested in. It comes up in the book, this sort of funny thing that I can't read his handwriting at first, and then it was quite impactful when I suddenly could. But I was obsessed with handwriting because of lossiness and because of this idea that I had to translate something that was a human mark into machine language in order for it to be legible to the computer. And I just really wanted to linger on that loss because I feel like there was something that was really important to me that was not able to be captured by our version of, an AI, and like potentially no version of an AI could ever capture whatever was like lost when it went from a mark on a piece of paper to a digital character. And, me putting my hand on the screen is like, okay, there's already a distance, right? Like the piece of paper is one thing. And then I took a picture of it and then it's on my computer and then I'm putting my hand on my computer. Like I was trying to kind of slow down the sort of lossiness process, right? That you can see the steps of me moving away from the original character. And I feel like my book is like the impulse of my book is that motion of like I'm trying. I'm probably never going to get there, but I'm trying to connect. And I just think that kind of, it's like an existential Sisyphean sort of beautiful impulse that we want to connect and we try, and there's something happens when we try, and the process is important, but you're always going to be at a remove. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks very much. First of all, if you can say anything more about Chatbots of the Dead, or if there's like a more specific working title or where one can keep one's eye out for the publication, I'd love to hear about it. Yeah. But my question, and you've kind of hinted at the answer throughout the evening, but to address it more directly, to what extent do you think that the chatbot is able to faithfully recreate Fred's personality? Like you mentioned, sort of this twofold response that he would have to this hypothetical question about what he would think about today's technology, that sort of thing. But like, I guess, does the data set provide access and insights into his personality beyond simply like the factual stuff that's recounted in order to be a faithful reflection of that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the insights in my book is that I'm not qualified to answer that question, but it's still a really great question. And I guess another insight that I came to, and that comes up in this paper that I'm working on, which will be published in Aeon, so you can look out for that soon. Is that what is a personality? Like, we have so many different personalities, right? Who we're talking to, we give different answers depending on who we're talking to. Like, we don't have one self. We have so many selves. And when I write a memoir about my family, right, I have to make decisions about how to cast that character for that scene and for the book as a whole. And often my work is trying to give you different versions of my family members in order to make explicit this concept of selves are, shaded, and we see them from one angle one day and from another angle another day. So I often make reference to that in my work. Often I do that with like switching drawing style to give you a sense that here's me, sort of here's, for example, in my first book, I switch fonts with my grandmother's voice in order to give you sort of like, here's how I see her and here's how she sees herself, and, things like that. So yeah, to the extent that the chatbot captured Fred's personality, like that would only ever, a person who was trying to capture his particular personality in a particular way that they happen to see it could sort of make that designation. And that's one of the insights that the paper I'm working on comes to is, you should be aware of the constraints of the characters that you're creating, right? So, okay, I'm creating a chatbot of my grandfather, but actually this is just a chatbot based on my grandfather's lectures, right? And label it that way and understand what it is in that way. Yeah.
I was just wondering, after you going through that process and getting to know your grandfather that way, have you changed your perception of your own father and his sister? I mean, yeah.
Did you say changed perception?
Or have you gained a different understanding of who your father is and his sister? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah, I mean, my father is he's a prolific inventor, and he's written about the future of technology and AI. And there's a sort of public Ray Kurzweil who's got this very optimistic perspective about, technology solving so many problems, giving people extended life. And I I always saw him as maybe like a scientist or a technical person, right? That was like he was like working with scientific theories and working with, like coding and figuring out how to solve problems. And I think the biggest insight I came to through working on my book and like finding documents about my father, which were also in the storage unit, right? Because identities are not so separable. But finding documents about my father is I realized that he's like really a poet. And that was cool. I found this old letter that he wrote his grandfather in the storage unit. So like, yeah, he wrote this to his maternal grandfather, but it's a 20-page letter where he's passionately defending his right to become a poet. Like, and I knew that my father had studied writing and that was like an interest of his, but it was just so interesting to be transported back to, my father as a 21-year-old having this totally different vision for his life that I can kind of see like, oh yeah, he's written books about visions of sort of future life that are poetic. They're like, what is it to be a futurist but to be kind of like a poetic like reader of prophecies, And so I came to an understanding of him in light of that legacy, like the creative artist legacy. And I think that was like also a way to feel closer to him, and see that we have similar, potentially similar missions in our life. Yeah.
time for one more. I'm getting a signal from the back.
Okay.
One more question.
Do you want to choose? Because I can't see.
No, I don't want to choose.
Okay. There's a hand.
Okay, you just mentioned something about your father. I was hoping that you were telling more about your father rather than your grandfather, because I'm very interested in the extension of human lifespan, and your father is a specialist in that. He's experienced with that, and he's doing all to do that, to experiencing and extending lifespan. Why don't you tell more about that, and and only about poems or about I'm just missing that, as you are the daughter. Thank you.
Yeah. You should read the book. There's a lot of my father in there. And also, yeah, it's like, what's the secret to longevity? Okay, the end of the show, we're all going to reveal how you live forever. Yeah. Well, what should I share about my father and longevity? I guess the thing I want to share is that an insight I came to about longevity through this book. There is a chapter, it's called Immortal Virtue. There's a chapter all about immortality in artificial. An insight I had was that there are kind of these two ways to live forever. One is like you just don't die, right? And I think we could give a whole other presentation on sort of like the AI's contribution to science and medicine, which would there'd be a lot to say there, and that's exciting. But I'm not qualified to give that presentation. But there's this this kind of immortality where you don't die. Your body just regenerates. You fix every problem. You solve aging. Okay. But then there's another kind of death, which is related to this concept of annihilation that I talked about in my presentation, which is the legacy on my mother's side. The kind of death where nobody remembers you, right? Where like you're not even in other people's minds anymore. And something I think is so interesting and meaningful about technology is that it makes annihilation really difficult. That people can like express themselves and express their existence through documentation. And then I think my father's idea that he's going to create, he's going to give like an artistic resurrection to his father through all the ways in which he had been documented. I think that's very poetic, and I became really interested in that kind of immortality. The idea that we, keep each other alive because we care about the artifacts of our lives and because we nurture our memories of people. So I think that's where I'll stop.
And the artifacts are, I like to think of them as beautiful mind children that we send to the future. So this book that you've released is another mind child that you can send to the future.
Yeah. Thank you, Holly. Thanks everyone for coming.